Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 16-week Adoption, Parenting, Coaching, and Certification. I'm Brian Post. I'm very excited to have you here with me to kick off our first session. I have had individual calls with a lot of you who are going through the certification component and touch base with some of you who are just doing the coaching component, and I've got a good grasp of kind of what you're looking for, so I'm very excited about that. This is going to be a jam-packed course. It's going to be lots of interaction, lots of information, and we're going to just do some soul searching. I mean, as I was putting this course together, I'm doing some soul searching myself, which I like. I like to continue to challenge myself, to look at my history. You know, I have my mom digging through, pictures, a suitcase of pictures, sending me pictures, and then that stirs up memories for her. And it just opens up dialogue, and so I think that this is going to be just a well-rounded experience for all of you. I'm so excited that you're here. I'm so excited to be able to share this information with you as we work together to create a love revolution, to continue our love revolution, and to be able to not only help ourselves, but more importantly, to be able to help others as they go through their transformation. But as Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. And that is so important, that message, that core message, be the change you want to see in the world. The essence of that is before we can work on changing someone else, before we can work on creating healing for someone else, we must be able to do that for ourselves. If we do not look within ourselves, if we are resistant to looking within ourselves, if we, for some reason, have some blindness that allows us to look within ourselves, it's going to make it really difficult for us to be able to see other people differently, because what shows up in our life and what shows up in our world is the reflection of relationship. What you see is mirrored deeply within you. And so the more accurately, the more adeptly you can look within you, the more you can pay attention to yourself, the more you can listen to yourself, the more effective you're going to be in being able to not only help your children, if that's why you're showing up for this training, but to be able to help yourself. So that just came from nowhere. I just thought about Gandhi saying that, and it's so true. And I don't know really how you would label this, and I don't know that it hasn't always been a primary focus. It has just occurred over the years as I've done this work, and I've just started to pay more attention to the words that we use. And this is what I want to do. I want to encourage you all to really pay attention to the words that you use, the statements that you make, because there is a vibration that is created in everything, and everything is a vibration. And every time you have a word, every time you have a thought, every time you make a statement, there is a vibration that gets created, and that vibration gets sent out to those you are in relationship with. So I really want you to think about that, the vibrations that we create in our lives, especially when we become stressed, just like this morning. I'm getting stressed because I'm home, and I know my family's here, and I know I want to be able to put on a really good educational moment for you all and a good presentation. I'm adding things to the presentation. I'm pulling things from the presentation at the last moment. Then my son's up, and he's already talking about being bored, and then I can feel my stress levels climbing. I can feel my amygdala getting activated, my adrenaline starting to take off. My wife kisses me on the cheek, and I'm like overwhelmed. I mean, it's just like, those are the things we just have to pay attention to. If we don't pay attention to those kinds of things, they manifest and take over, because those are the vibrations that we create. So we have to be able to be more mindful of ourselves in those moment-to-moment situations. And when you can't, see, because we're not perfect, when you can't be mindful of yourself in those situations, the best thing you can do, and sometimes I think that this is even better than being mindful in the situation. is after the situation has occurred to pay attention to it, to listen to it, to break it down, to analyze it, to process it, because that's when you start to truly make radical growth in your life. When not so much in those moments, because I've said to families before at the end of a lecture or professionals or parents, go out and just screw up just as fast as you can. Because the sooner you screw up, and the sooner you realize it, the sooner you can stop, you can take into account what just happened, and then you can think about, what could I have done differently? How could I manage that differently? I know how I could have managed this morning even differently. Is just by preparing earlier, pre-planning. You know, making sure yesterday I had everything in the presentation that I wanted to have in the presentation. See, that would lower my stress levels. So see, those kinds of things become really important to our growth. They become really important to our understanding. You know, maybe not doing the presentation from home, maybe going down to the office and doing it from there. That way I know it's completely quiet. I know there are no interruptions. I know there are no other sensory experiences. So I have a stress-sensitive amygdala. I am fearful. I am easily fearful. I am my stress, my very sensitive amygdala sends all of my cellular system into constriction. And I've had to spend a lot of years really learning to be mindful of that, really learning how sensory stimulation can really overwhelm me. I can't remember, just the other day, I met a friend of mine at a local bar and grill down the street, and he had a business associate that he wanted me to meet, and so I went down and I met him, and I had been literally at home working all day. So I had ran a few errands, but otherwise I was back home, and it was quiet. Like when I'm here by myself and I'm working, and Donnie's at school, and the kids are at school, my wife's at work. I mean, it's completely quiet. Every now and then I'll turn on a little music, but it's just quiet, and it just allows my brain just to settle and just to focus. I just cut out all the sensory input other than what I'm focused on, and having the windows open. I love to have the windows open because it's like when I was a kid, I used to be able to study with the radio on, and I realized that the process that would occur was that when I would lose my attention and my focus on what homework assignment I was working on, I would go back to the radio and I'd listen to the radio for a little while, which would allow me a distraction, but it would allow me a distraction within a contained environment. So after I listened to the music for a while, I could then go back and focus on my work. Now, I didn't realize that that's what I was doing until I was an adult. I just was reflecting on that. I was like, oh, wow, that's what I was doing. I was creating containment for myself. That was helping me to regulate by giving me a safe distraction until I was able to go back and focus on my work. So that's really important for me even now. I mean, when I go into an environment, like when I have to give a lecture, hours before the lecture, I mean, I really start to shut down my sensory pathways, and I really start to have to focus on what it is that I'm doing. It's like my whole spirit and all my energy just starts to, it goes from a great big kind of vibration to it just funnels down into a zone, into a tunnel, and it's no different than athletes preparing for a big athletic event. You just get prepared, you get focused, you get in your zone, and that's when you're driving all of your energy into that one performance. And that's what I like to do. I mean, I take this work so very seriously, but the point of that is you have to pay attention to yourself. And then once you start paying attention to yourself, and here's the radical point. Once you really start to learn about yourself, once you really start to pay attention to yourself, that's when the window to being able to understand and learn about your child starts to just open up. That's when you start to step into a brave new world. When you really start to pay attention to yourself, that becomes so very important. So much of our initial work together is going to be laying the foundation. And so as a part of laying the foundation, I'm going to start off with this first concept. Adoption versus adoptive. this is going back to the paying attention to these words. I was having this conversation with my wife, and I was saying, well, honey, do you think this should be the 16-week adoption parenting course, or should this be the 16-week adoptive parenting course? And she gave me some thought, and she said, you know what? Adoptive is kind of like a label. You don't want parents to just feel like they're adoptive parents. You don't want them to always have to be adoptive parents. And I thought, you know what, that is a unique point, because in so many ways, we don't want to be adoptive parents. When I introduce my son to other people, I don't say this is my adopted son, Kevin. I say this is my son, Kevin. It's just like my son, Donnie. I don't say this is my stepson, Donnie. I say this is my son, Donnie. So we really want to pay attention to those labels that we use, but at the same time, and here's an even bigger thought for you. As a parent who has adopted a child, you do not want to create a framework and a perspective for yourself that moves you away from the fact that your child is adopted. You want to hold that perspective in mind, not so you can have the label of this is my adopted child, but rather so you can have the understanding that by having an adopted child, I have a child who 98% of the time has some unique characteristics that my other children may not have. 98% of the time, this child has had an experience that your biological children have not had. And so I said to my wife, you know, the adoptive thing is very true, but on the other side of that, you don't want to forget about the fact that this child's been adopted, because this is not a biological child. Not that biological children don't have their own instances of trauma and stress and negative experiences and loss of grief and all that. It's all the same. And let me qualify this entire training. Now, my focus is on adoption, because that's my passion. It's what I am the most deeply touched by. But all of this course, at any given time, all you have to do is substitute adoption for biological, adoption for foster care, foster child, adoption for grandchild, adoption for stepchild. All you have to do is substitute the name, the title, the language. That's it. Everything else is the same. We are all fundamentally the same. So these are just labels. These are just labels which help us to focus in a very specific way. Now, when you think about this from the perspective of your certification and being a coach, this is a label that helps you focus on a specific niche, a specific area. And that's what I focus on. That's what I'm focused on now. The majority of my early career has been focused on trying to be all things to all people, which I believe the stress model, and I believe love-based parenting and relationship, of course, it applies to all people. But now in this next stage of my career, I want to focus just on adoption. So that's my focus, that's my passion. So the key here is always remember that your child has a unique history and a unique experience. You cannot forget that, because that creates the lens through which you look upon your child. See, so much of this is all about changing the lens through which we view our children. And I've always thought I would love to have a pair of glasses, like a pair of shades, like the kids' glasses that they say they're the FBI glasses, and you can look behind yourself. They're a little corny looking, but they have a little shaded lens in them. I would love to be able to make a pair of those glasses. I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to try to get that done. And if anyone feels like they have any kind of resources that can help me with that, feel free to shoot me an email. But I'm going to get a pair of these little corny sunglasses made. It's going to have a little lens inside of them, a little shaded lens, and inside the little shaded lens is going to be an infant. So that when you are looking at another person, the lens you are looking through is one of infancy. so that you can see not just the person, but the infant within the person. See, that is essential when talking about adoption parenting. When you look upon your child, you have to see the infant. If you fail to see the infant, then you fail to see the child. You fail to see the teenager. And I always refer to teenagers as children, too. It doesn't make any difference. There are no age limits on this information. This is adult, any age from 0 to the end of time. So you could be looking at your 25-year-old son. You have to see the infant. I want you to be able to see the infant because that's your lens. Your lens, the lens through which you look upon, defines your reality. It defines what you see. So you have to be able to see that. You have to be able to grasp in any given moment, as often as you can and with as much depth as you can, you have to be able to grasp the infant within the individual. Because that helps you, let me tell you why. Let me tell you why. That helps you to not feel threatened. So you never would have thought about that angle, would you? You never would have considered that angle. But that is a critical angle. And that angle, it defines the basis of our most basic relationship interactions and engagement. When you look at another individual, when you can see the infant within them, your brain will not feel threatened by that individual. When you can't see the infant within them, when you can't see the scared infant, when you can't see the hopeless infant, when you can't see the helpless infant, when you can't see the despondent infant, when you can't see the upset, the threatened, the fearful infant, when you can't see the infant, you cannot see the person. You are seeing yourself. You are reacting from your own fear. You're reacting from your own threat. You must be able to see the infant. I'm going to get those glasses made. I'm going to make sure each one of you get a pair. I'm going to have to get busy on that. I have very little idea where to start on that, but I'm going to get those made. So it didn't start at adoption, and it doesn't end there. It didn't start at adoption, and it doesn't end there either. When you brought your child into your home at whatever age, that was not the beginning of their life. That was not the beginning of your life. And it's not the end. It's not the end of the life they've lived. It's not the end of the life you've lived. It's the beginning of the relationship that the two of you will continue to have until your final breath. But it's not the beginning. It doesn't start. Their life doesn't start when they come to you. Your life didn't start that way. So what makes us able to just forget about and not think about and not be concerned with what the early experiences may have been? And then we forget, this is what we move away from the most readily, we forget what our own experiences have been, leading us up to these dynamics, leading us up to the process of adoption. Why did you adopt? What was going on in your life that led you to adoption? And of course, there are many variables that lead to adoption. It is your responsibility, it's my responsibility, as your coach, as your teacher, as your guide, to explore that with you. Okay, if I'm working with you as a parent, the same way I have to do with myself, it's my responsibility to explore that. And let me just be really honest here. I adopted my son, my wife at the time, Christy, we adopted our son because he didn't have anywhere else to go. Number one, we had been running a group home in Virginia, and we did that for several years, and I was tired, she was tired, we were ready to go home. So we had transitioned out most all of the kids. I think we had 2 kids left, and one of them we transitioned to a therapeutic foster care placement. which for us was success because it was a step down from our residential level group home. And then we had Kevin. And Kevin's social worker was not presenting anything very promising. And in fact, neither Christy or I trusted that Kevin's outcome was going to be very good. Because as much progress as he had made, most people still didn't get him. They still didn't understand it. So we adopted out of some level of responsibility, but also some level of guilt, that we had brought this child this far in his process. And for us, because we had a business which happened to be a group home, that because we decided to shut it down, he was going to have to go live somewhere else. It really wasn't fair to him. We really didn't feel like he had any more healthy options. So there's a level of guilt that's involved in that decision. Now, how does that show up? Well, that shows up on the days when he's not in such a good place. You know, when we first moved back home and he's not in such a good place, and he's, you know, acting out in some way, and then I become upset because underneath that is this resentment, this level of resentment that I've taken on this child into my life that's not even my child, who doesn't appreciate, you know, whatever, he doesn't listen to me, blah, 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 blah. You know the self-talk. You know the stress-driven cognitive distortions. You get that, but here's the thing. Do you own it? Do you own it? Do you really pay attention to what the underlying causes for you to seek to adopt are? Or do you say things like, I just wanted to make a difference in a child's life, as honoring of a statement as that is? You're deceiving yourself. No one adopts simply because they want to make a difference in a child's life. There are unconscious dynamics. We are 90% unconscious. There are unconscious dynamics that go into every decision we make. And that unconscious decision to adopt at the age of 40 may have actually started when we were 3 years old, or when we were infants, or when we were 6 or 7. But you have to delve into that. You have to ask yourself, what is driving this decision? Why do you have to ask yourself that? Because that's your self-understanding, the development of the understanding of yourself. That's the understanding that goes into the honoring of yourself when you feel really angry at your adopted child, or you feel really disconnected, or you feel really hopeless, or you feel really helpless, or really overwhelmed, or you feel like you just want to give up. See, that's the honesty that occurs when you ask yourself that question. When those emotions come up, when you're really honest with those emotions, that's how you can move through them. That's how you can understand them. That's how you can settle them. That's how you can work through them and process through them. See, because otherwise you make it all about the child. I could have made it all about Kevin at any given point in time. Lord knows, you know, at 18 he still had an abundance of stuff he had to go through, even though he had come so far in those few years. And see, during that process, I have to still pay attention to myself. I still have to honor what's going on in my own life, my own personal struggles, my interpersonal struggles, my relationship struggles. I have to honor all that. I have to look at all of that. So it didn't start at adoption, and it doesn't end there either. Adoption is a multi-level experience. Not only do you have the adopted child, not only do you have the adopted parent, but you have everything that goes into the making of that child before they arrive into your arms. You have every experience. You have the birth experience, everything that occurred in those 9 months or earlier. Every single experience. that goes into that child, the making of who that child is. When you bring that child into your home, you have that child's biological mother in your home. You have that child's biological father in your home. You have the generations of that child in your home. You have all of their history in your home. And then there's your experience. The same thing. You have all that history. And all of those histories are coming together. All of those levels of experience are coming together in a cellular way. And you think about this as two big buckets of water. Two big buckets of water are coming together, and they're dumping into a bigger bucket of water. And they are combining. That's what happens to our cells. All of your cellular experience, your physiology, your brain wiring, your hormones, your chemicals, we're dumping all that into a bigger bucket, and we're combining it. And that's called the process of entrainment. The process of entrainment. It's when physiologies spend enough time with one another that they become connected. And in becoming connected, they become literally enmeshed. And when they become enmeshed, when one physiology is upset, the other physiology is upset, the other physiology is upset. You've heard of the saying, if mom ain't happy, nobody's happy. Well, that's the significance of physiologic enmeshment, entrainment, is that our cellular systems become enmeshed. We are a family unit. We are one organism, thriving and surviving together. That's why it's so important that when working with children, and I do the quotes with my hands, working with children, that you are not working just with the child, you are working with the entire family. That's why it's imperative. That's why there's no other way. Any other way is setting the child up for potentially continuing to be scapegoated, is setting the parents up for potentially just to be disempowered. There is no other way than working with the family, because everyone is connected in the family. You cannot take the pea out of the soup, put salt and pepper on the pea. I don't care how much salt and pepper you put on that little bitty pea. When you drop it back up into the soup of that family's entrainment, the seasoning will not change. The taste will not change, because it is a multi-level experience. It involves everyone. Everyone has a role. So when you start thinking about your child, your adopted child, and you start thinking about the issues that she has, and the challenges and the struggles, you have to take into consideration all of the challenges and struggles that go into everyone else that's a part of the family. You cannot make that one child solely responsible for the conflict that's going on in the family, because even though that child brings their entire history to the pot, you bring your entire history too. If there's a spouse, he brings his entire history too. If there are other children, they bring their entire history too. You can't discount those histories, because once people have spent enough time together, they become physiologically enmeshed. That's the process of entrainment. I believe research says it takes about 6 months. It takes about 6 months for entrainment to occur, where you are literally connected to another person, and that the loss of that person will cause a disruption in your physiology. That's called grief. Understanding all aspects of the experience are crucial. You have to be able to look at all levels of the adoption story, everyone's story. When you're in the midst of conflict, and this is what's important. This is important on so many levels. For years I've been working with families. I've always started with the parents. The reason I've always started with the parents is because ultimately the parents are responsible for creating an oxytocin-rich environment. I'm going to say that again. The parents are ultimately responsible for creating an environment and the relationships that foster oxytocin. See, that's how you make the distinction between the parent being blamed versus the parent being responsible. This is not about blaming the parent. The same way this is not about blaming the child. But the beginning of the creation of a healing environment, of a healing home, of a healing relationship starts with the adult. There's no other way around it. We'll look a little bit at neurology today, but and then we'll get deeper into it later in the course, but there's no other way around it. Oxytocin, the brain's anti-stress hormone, the love hormone, the bonding hormone, the hormone that makes love possible, is a learned hormone. The only way you learn that hormone is in your relationship with others. And those initial relationships are always with adults. And you can't learn oxytocin from an individual who doesn't know oxytocin themselves, who doesn't have it. So it's very important that when we're talking about helping to heal children, helping to heal adopted children, that the parents be willing to take responsibility for the environment that's getting created, for the relationships that are getting created. You can't put that on the child. Now, you can't take, this is the other side of that, you can't take that child's behaviors personally, which is what we do. But that goes back to the lens. You take their behaviors personally because you're looking through the wrong lens. You're looking through the lens of threat. You're looking through the lens of fear. You're looking through the lens of stress. You're not looking through the lens of understanding who this child is and where they come from and what they're dealing with and what their pain is and what their abuse and what their trauma has been, therefore how that drives their behavior. You're looking through your own lens, which means you're looking through the lens of threat and fear when you take that child's behavior personally. Now, you have to be willing to take responsibility for that child and their behavior. Now, that's a hard one. But listen to me when I say that in the context of oxytocin. When I say that in the context of oxytocin, what I am telling you is that when that child is in the midst of negative behavior, when that child is in the midst of acting out, then what is occurring is that child is demonstrating that they have a depressed oxytocin response. When I say you have to be willing to take responsibility for that child's behavior and for that child, what I'm saying is that you have to be willing to create a consistent, predictable, secure environment so that child can start to learn oxytocin response when stressed, because stress drives negative behavior. And if you're not willing to take responsibility to teach that child, they're not going to get it. And that's how children end up in residential treatment centers and foster home after foster home after foster home. I mean, that was Kevin's experience. Kevin, my 22-year-old son, he's 22 now, but he grew up on the streets. His parents, his family abandoned him, and he was from 4 years old on, he was in a couple of different foster homes where he was sexually abused, physically abused. And then when he got old enough, he hit the streets. And he lived on the streets, and he survived on the streets. And when he was 10 years old, he decided he had heard that his family had moved to the United States, so he decided that that's where he was going to head. It took him a while to get going and get moving in the right direction, but he eventually got on the train, got with everyone else, and he headed to the United States. He was 12 years old when he landed in the United States. He ended up in Catholic Charities, and no one understood him. No one understood his history. No one understood what he had gone through. No one understood the experiences that influenced his behavior, and therefore no one was willing to take responsibility for him. So what they just did, in the name of taking responsibility, they just put him in one facility after the next. See, we call that responsibility. That's not responsibility. We are so quick as adults to want to try to teach children responsibility, and we're not taking responsibility ourselves. So we don't get it. We don't get the very nature, the very definition, the very experience of what that means. To teach a child responsibility is to first take responsibility yourself. The modeling of responsibility is how you teach children to be responsible. But to just say to a child, I'm going to teach you responsibility by making you have this consequence, that's not teaching the child responsibility. That's teaching the child how to be reactive. See, the whole debate about giving children consequences, it's not that difficult. It's very simple when you understand the physiology underneath it, when you understand the hormones underneath it, when you understand the importance of relationship, when you understand how children learn, how we all learn. We learn through modeling. When you just give a child a consequence for some behavior that they can't ultimately in that moment that they can't really control because they're stressed out, and when you're stressed, your thinking is confused and distorted, and your short-term memory is suppressed. And I'll get all back to this. We're going to go deep. We're going to go deep into this. We're going to go deep into this over the next 16 weeks. We're going to cover this at every level. But when you're stressed out, your thinking is confused and distorted, and you're not thinking clearly, your short-term memory is suppressed, and you're misbehaving because you're overwhelmed, you're saying things that you shouldn't, you're not in a place to be able to do anything about your behavior. You're only in a place of survival. The only state that you can focus on, the only state that you can maintain in that moment is the state you're in. That's the only state you can contend with. When you're in a state of distress, that's the only state that you can. That's the only state that you can be in. And so when you just give that child a punishment, that's what a consequence is at that level. It's a punishment. Punishment doesn't teach anyone anything, because in order to be able to be taught, you have to be in a place of clear thinking. See, it's a punishment at that level. The reason we use punishment is to control and to force our will onto others. Punishment is used to modify the behaviors of others against their will in the name of our will. So at that level, it's a punishment. You're not doing anything to teach responsibility because you're not taking responsibility. You're just punishing. In order to teach responsibility, you have to be willing to take responsibility. So we're going to be getting into that during this whole 16 weeks. And you have to bear with me. Sometimes I just get really worked up. It's because I'm just passionate about this work. So let's talk about two very different stories. And then we're going to talk about a third one. My story. I'll share with you all a little bit about me and where I came from. What went into the making of who I am. Look at that cute little boy. I was looking at his picture this morning, and I could feel my body reacting. I could see a child who was obviously happy. But look at my feet. I have casts on my feet because my legs had been broken because I was so bow-legged. A barbaric practice based out of fear, right? You know, parents, they have some kind of fear, a concern about children being bow-legged. I don't really know why. I don't think there's really anything that, you know, scientifically that says, you know, if your child's bow-legged, they're going to have, you know, an abundance of issues or anything. But doctors reinforce it by breaking children's legs and putting them in a cast to reset them. So here I am in a cast, but I'm happy. I think fundamentally I've always been pretty happy. But there's hurt and there's pain in that body. There's hurt and there's pain in that brain. So where was my biological mother? She was married. She had 3 children. And then she met my father, Michael. Michael was 18 years old at the time. We're almost 20 years old. And her father, her husband, I'm sorry. Oh, well, this is interesting. Her father, as a side note, had murdered her mother when she was 9 years old. So that's my biological mother's. That's in her history. So that's in my DNA. That's in my genetics. And then she and her siblings essentially raised each other with the help of an aunt or a grandma or something like that. Then she met my father, my biological father. His father fell 5 or 6 stories off of a building when he was 15 or 16 years old and died. He died. And so shortly after that, he ended up being sent to a boys' home. So while he was in the boys' home, his mother got remarried and moved across the country to Muskogee, Oklahoma. He was from Washington, D.C. My biological mother is from Muskogee, Oklahoma. So when my dad was 18 years old, 17 or 18 years old, he rode a motorcycle across the country to Muskogee, and that's where he spent and graduated from high school. That's where he met my mother. Now, her husband at the time, she'd gotten married really early. Her husband at the time was in Germany in the military, and he had told her that he wasn't going to come back. So she met my father, and they fell in love. Well, then she got pregnant, and then she finds out that her husband is going to come back, and she thought he actually had another family in Germany. So that, that kind of in her mind gave her the permission to kind of move on. But then she finds out he's going to come back, and now she finds out she's pregnant with me. So she's got 3 children, and I have 3 half siblings. They're all 1, 2, 3. We are back to back to back. The brother right above me, he just had a birthday. I turned 41 in June. He just turned 42. My sister is 43, and my oldest brother is 44. So my mother is now faced with the reality that she's got 3 children. She got 1 on the way. She loves this 18-year-old man, but there's no way he can take care of his family because he's a player. He's out there doing his thing. And so she tells her husband, and he says, you got to get rid of the baby. You got to get an abortion. And she said, okay. Now, if you think about this, during the 1970s, a woman with 3 children and a baby on the way, what do you think her options were? You think she was looking at a lifetime of professional success, business success? You think she was looking at a lifetime of being able to get married, expect some man to come in and marry her with a single mom with 4 children? In her mind at that moment, there just weren't many options. And so she told her husband, yes, she will have an abortion. And that's the last he knew. He never came back. He never saw her pregnant or anything like that because he was in Germany. So when I met her 37 years later, as I'm kind of going through my process of meeting my biological parents, and I met both of them, there came a time as I was going through an emotional process, a very personal process. I said to her, we need to talk. We'd already been talking in communication. I'd already met all the family. Things were good. Things were good. But I said, you know what? I need to talk. I need to know what you felt when you were pregnant with me. I want to know about that. She said, okay. So I drove down and we got into that. We dug into that. But the reality is she didn't have many options. And I asked her, I said, how did you feel? She said, I always enjoyed being pregnant. I said, in my core, I knew that. In my core, I knew that. She said, I always enjoyed being pregnant. I enjoyed being pregnant with you. She said, I didn't smoke. I didn't drink. She said, I ate lots of salmon. Do you like salmon? I said, I love salmon. She said, I ate lots of salmon and hot links. She said, you just used to love those hot links. And she said, but I really loved you. I loved you. I loved you so much, and I took good care of you. And then I said, at what point did you know you weren't going to be able to keep me? She said, at about 7 months. At about 7 months. She said, I was never going to have an abortion. I wasn't going to do it. I loved you too much. But she said at 7 months, I knew I was going to have to place you for adoption. See, 37 years later, when I called her, and I said, there's a series of conversations, but I said, 37 years ago, June 4th, you had a little boy, and I think that was me. She asked me, how'd you get my number? How'd you, who are you? And what's this about? And she said, I need to call you back. I'm going to have to call you back. And I said, okay. I said, I don't want anything. I don't want to cause any problems. I just want to find out my roots. I just want to know who I am. She said, I'll call you back tomorrow. I said, that's fine. And about 30 minutes later, she called me back. She said, baby, you're right. I'm your mom. I'm so sorry. I love you. I had to tell my husband. He didn't know. But I did. I gave birth to you. I'm your mom, and I have thought about you every day since. Her husband didn't know that she'd carried me to term. There were only two people that knew, her and her sister, Gloria. The only two people that knew I existed. She had carried that burden and lived with that secret her whole life. Her whole life. And I've said to her routinely, I say to her often, I text her and call her, I say, I am so thankful for you, for having the courage to give me life. I'm so thankful. And she said, are you mad at me? Are you angry? Can you ever forgive me, is what she said. I said, I've never held anything against you. I said, I've had a great life. And I have. My adopted parents, they're my parents. They're my mom and dad. I call Wilma Mom when I talk to her, but she knows. And she says, how's your mom? Because she knows they're my mom and dad. They're always my mom and dad. I said, they were good. They were good to me. I didn't grow up in any bad way. And they didn't. They had lots of struggles. They did the best they could. They did the best they could. So I said, there's nothing to forgive you for. And I've said to her, because of you, your courage has changed thousands of lives in this world. Because of you. And so that's where it started for me. That's where it started, and I have struggled through that early experience my entire life. Because when she said at 7 months old, I said, how did you feel when you knew you were going to place me for adoption? She said, I became depressed. She said, I knew I had to detach myself from it. I know that experience. I feel that experience right now I feel that experience in my body. I know what that feels like. She said, I had to disconnect. And she said, I never even held you. I never even saw you. So after I was placed for adoption, I went into 2 different foster homes. All I know about those homes is that I was considered a good baby, and I like to sleep on my stomach. I still do. You're considered a good baby when you don't make noise. You're considered a good baby when you don't cry a lot. You're considered a good baby when you're not colicky. But what does that really mean, a good baby? All babies are good. All babies are gifts from God. All babies are opportunities for changing our world. All babies are possibility. But when we say good baby, just like we can say bad baby, what does that really mean? A baby who may not cry all the time, that doesn't mean that the baby is not failure to thrive. That doesn't mean that the baby is not depressed and overwhelmed and shut down. That doesn't mean the baby doesn't want to die because they feel just so despondent and alone and disconnected. But we call that a good baby. It's just another one of those things that we do, those words that we use. We talk about good babies. I was adopted at 3 months of age by Bill and Opal. My mom says the first time they held me, I was smiling. This is my family today. It's my daughter Marley between my legs, my wife Tammy, it's my son Donnie. These are my two girls. This is Michaela. Michaela's now a freshman in college, and this is Marley. She's just my little peach. I just love her to death. Marley has spina bifida. She's smart as a whip, and she's going to do something amazing in this world. She's 10 years old. So Michaela's 18. She'll be 19 May 25th, and Marley's 10. And then this is Kevin. I took this picture of Kevin. Kevin used to stay up all night long. And then when everyone else was getting up, he'd go to sleep. He just goes to sleep anywhere, in the middle of the floor, on the couch. And when Kevin goes to sleep, you cannot wake him up. It's because he stays up so. He used to say, I don't think he does that anymore. I know he doesn't do it anymore because he's got a full-time job. And he's got a baby on the way, so I'm going to be a grandpa soon. But this is Kevin. He's 22 years old now. He's doing really well. Really, I'm very proud of him. I love all my children. But let's talk about the other story. This is my sister, Christy. She was adopted as an infant, too. And this is one of my favorite pictures of her. She used to love her cheeks and her nose and her chin. I squeeze her nose all the time. I just love her nose. And her daughter now looks just like her. Well, here's the thing. Christy was believed to have been born with prenatal exposure to alcohol and possibly drugs. She was born premature, weighing only 3 pounds. She could fit in the palm of your hand. Do you think we remember that when Christy turns 8 years old and when she's emotionally immature and she's not doing good at school and she doesn't have very many friends and she likes to play with kids who are 6? Do you think we'll remember that when she's 10 years old, we're driving in the car and my dad says sit back and she's talking, chattering incessantly? What do you hear? You hear that, don't you? Isn't that a reactive attachment disorder characteristic? Children who talk nonstop, incessantly about everything, we call that chattering, constant chatter. So if you're on the other side of where I've been and what I've witnessed and what I've gone through and what I now believe, not believe, but know, and then you hear other professionals label children in these manners, in these ways, the constant chatter. My sister was one of those kids. She'd set up on the back of the chairs before we even had seatbelts in cars. My dad was a Vietnam vet, so he had severe PTSD when he came back from Vietnam. Not to mention his own history. He was one of the oldest of 9, and his father was an alcoholic. So he was pretty hard. And then he'd learn to parent hard because that's what he had experienced. So when he'd say, she'd be up there on the back of the seat, and I'd be up there with her because we were, listening to what they're talking about. We're talking about whatever we want to talk about, and wanting to change the radio station. And finally, he starts to get stressed out. So I didn't know this then. I know it now. He started to get stressed out. He'd start to get overwhelmed. Now, what he probably should have done is he probably should have turned the radio off. That would have been the first thing he could have done. And then he could have said, kids, I need you guys to calm down. I need you to go ahead and sit back for a minute. Give Dad a break. I'm feeling stressed. Yeah, it's all ideal, right? It's all ideal. What if that would have happened? I'd have been being raised by the Dalai Lama if that was the case, but that wasn't the case. So my dad was, he started to get overwhelmed. He'd say, sit back. Y'all need to sit back. My dad was a big man. He worked in a rock quarry my whole life. It's not being premature, not spending the first 3 months of my life in an incubator, not being prenatal exposed to alcohol and drugs. I had a brain that was a little healthier than my sister's. I had a memory system that was a little bit more active than my sister's, so I would sit back. And guess what she'd do? She'd stay right there. And she'd keep chattering. And he'd say, I said sit back. Now, after this experience happened a few times, occasionally she'd go ahead and sit back for a minute, but it didn't take long, so she's right back up there. And then finally, without any third warning, he would, from hands, big hand, from steering wheel, rear back and backhand her right in the mouth. Bam! It would knock her right back into the seat. And of course, she would not only be horrified and in terrible pain, she'd be screaming, oh my gosh. And I couldn't do anything but shake my head because I knew it was coming. Why did I know it was coming? Because it happened before. This wasn't something that happened once. So when people start talking to me about consequences and why children have to have consequences and why consequences are so important, I'm just going to tell them, you're full of crap. I've seen the most extreme form of consequences at all levels, not just this kind of consequence, my sister getting backhanded, and I know it doesn't work. And neurology tells you it doesn't work because a stressed-out brain suppresses the short-term memory. So you don't even remember it. At the end of the day, when all the pain is gone, a couple hours later, you forget that you just got knocked right in your mouth. And it happened over and over and over again. My dad smacking my sister back into the seat was not teaching her responsibility. It was not teaching her how to regulate her emotions. It was not teaching her how to release oxytocin. All it was doing was severing the relationship, planting the seeds for a future of a lot of conflict between my parents and my sister. That's all it was doing. She spent her first 3 months alone in an incubator. She was adopted at 4 months of age. My mom says the first time she held my sister, she was crying. The first time she held me, I was smiling. The first time she held my sister, she was crying. I believe those are critical moments in relationship. I believe when you adopt a child, that just like there are critical moments of brain development, that if certain things don't happen at certain times, the windows of opportunities close, and it's really hard to reopen. See, those are developmental stages. Those are critical developmental stages. And I believe adoption is the same way. When you first adopt a child, there are critical stages in that first 6 months of your relationship, and it starts from day one. It starts from the first smile. It starts from the first touch. It starts from the first sound of your voice. Critical moments that occur, and if you miss those, they're really hard to get back. Well, my parents missed lots of those with my sister, because if my sister's crying, and think about all the children who have all the parents who have adopted internationally, and the deficits. Yes, we have deficits here with the domestic adoptions, but the international adoptions and the kids who have been through horrible abuse and no soothing, and they've been in orphanages with countless numbers of other children, and there's just sheer neglect. And the times I have talked to parents and they've said, oh, she was in a really good orphanage, there were only 15 kids. What? What? 15 kids to 2 workers is a good orphanage? Are you serious? We've got to change our lens. Yes, can it be worse? Absolutely, it could be worse. But that's not good. There's nothing good about that. You cannot say orphanage and good in the same sentence. It doesn't exist. You can't say adoption and good in the same sentence. It doesn't exist. If your child was adopted, they've experienced severe trauma. Trauma that has created indelible imprints on their brain and perhaps irreparable damage. Adoption is a lifelong trauma. It doesn't just go away. It doesn't. So those moments, that moment between my mother and my sister, that's a critical moment. Between my sister and my dad, that's a critical moment. If my mom's not able to soothe my sister in that critical moment, guess what? My mom becomes stressed. And when my mom becomes stressed, my sister's stressed, and my dad gets stressed. And guess what the initial stages of the relationship are? Cortisol. The initial stages of the relationship are cortisol, not oxytocin. If I'm smiling at my mom the first time I meet her and she's smiling at me, guess what the initial stages of the relationship are? Guess what the initial foundations, the building blocks of the relationship are? Oxytocin, the love hormone. You see what I'm saying? You see why that's so important? Why that's so critical? There are early developmental stages that if we miss those, it is very hard to get those back. We have to work really hard because our brain as the adult, as the parent, gets rewired also. See, so our experience is it's the mirror of the mirror neurons. Mirror neurons. We have these neurons in our brain that mirror one another. So if a child is crying and the parent gets frustrated, the child mirrors the frustration and the stress, which just reinforces it. It still happens. It happens to this day. Go smile at someone. As soon as you get off this call, off this first training, just smile at your child and see what happens. They'll smile back. And then, depending on your child's history, they may frown and wonder why the heck you're smiling at them, or your husband too, for that nature. But they're mirror neurons. So there are critical moments that occur that reinforce our brain, so we have to keep these things in mind. Early stages, the early moments are very important. Our parents did the best they could, but they were not equipped and not ready for what they encountered. They just weren't. They weren't educated about what was the real core of adoption, and most are not. In this country, there's probably 90% miscommunication and misinformation and miseducation that goes into training foster parents and adoptive parents. There's still huge deficits. There are some states that are doing some really good stuff. There are other states, they're not doing bad stuff. When I say doing really good stuff, I know there are states out there training their parents on stress and trauma and emotions and love and fear and love-based parenting. I call that good stuff. But do I think that the states out there and the departments that are actually just training, doing MAPS training and doing the same old training that they've been doing, do I think that that's bad stuff? No, I don't. I don't believe it's bad stuff. I believe they're doing the best they can. They don't know any different. And sometimes, even when we do know different, it's just too hard to make change. It's too hard to make change. So we keep doing the same thing. But at the same level, we can't just keep doing the same thing and expect a different outcome. That's the definition of insanity. So my parents weren't equipped. I mean, we went through many, many days of hell in my family. Many, many nights. And they weren't, not only, they sure weren't equipped for what happened with the struggle with my sister. I was a little better. Socially, I was better. Educationally, I was more mainstream, accomplished. My sister was more mechanical. She should have been brought up in a Montessori school, and she should have been focused on building engines. No one saw that, though. She had an engineering mind. She was brilliant, but no one saw that. So I was better socially. She was emotionally regressed. So she got all the focus, all the negative attention was focused on her, even though I had all kinds of severe behaviors as a kid. Half the times my parents just didn't know it. My dad has passed away since. My mom knows it because I tell her. I mean, she's been hearing me lecture for years now, but both of them were able to hear me lecture. So, they know now, they understand now, but they don't understand then. And this is not to blame my parents. I feel like my parents did the best they could. I mean, every whipping I took as a kid, my parents were doing the best that they could. But does that mean it's okay? No, it's not okay. Does that mean I advocate that other parents should whip their children? Absolutely not. Do I hide behind the crazy thought, well, look how I turned out. I turned out okay. Are you serious? Are you serious? I have, when parents say that, that's the most comical thing. I'm like, really? Are you being honest? They weren't ready. They weren't equipped. They weren't educated. They just didn't know. And so just a little brief overview of the brain. I'm talking about oxytocin here. I've talked about the amygdala. You see kind of these parts of the brain. This is just a general overview of the brain. It's not all of the brain, obviously, but these are the specific components that I want you to understand. I really want you to grasp. I want you to be able to grasp, and we're going to do that through this training. You're going to grasp the amygdala and what that really means. You're going to grasp the brainstem, the pituitary gland, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and the oxytocin response, and the prefrontal cortex. You're going to grasp all of that. And you're going to see, you're going to look through that lens, and as you look through that lens, not only are your perception of your perception of yourself going to change, but the perception of your children is going to change. It's going to change radically. The perception of the people you work with is going to change. But you want to be able to grasp that these are the basic primary areas involved in stress and emotion. Primary areas, but your whole body, there's no separation between the brain and the body. That's why I have the spinal cord and the neurocircuitry, because you have neurocircuitry which runs from your amygdala and your brainstem all the way down into your adrenal glands. So there's no separation. That you heard, all of you have experienced a gut feeling. Candace Purse says a gut feeling is not a metaphor. It is a biological reality, because what happens in the brain also happens in the gut. That's that neurocircuitry. That's why all of a sudden you can walk into some environment and you smell something and boom, your stomach immediately gets upset, because that neurocircuitry goes from your amygdala right down into your gut. So we're going to learn about this. We're going to delve into this during the next 16 weeks. When you walk away from this, you're going to understand this. You're going to get this at a level that you haven't before. So then I want to talk about a third very different adoption story. And this is how we're going to pull this all together. So you've heard a little bit about my story, about my sister's story. That's the framework of my reality. That's the framework of my experience. That's where I came from. That's what informs this work. Everything I hear, everything I interpret is reflected through the framework of my experience. And I understand my experience at a very deep level. And I try to look at it, and I spent years and years looking at it. And I try to see it from moment to moment. But then there's a third, very different adoption story, and this is the story from my perspective as a therapist with a young man that I worked with. Matthew's 12 years. He's a 12-year-old boy when I first met him. He's evaluated for in-home treatment. 100 hours. At the time, I was doing a 100-hour program where I would go in. I was traveling all over the world, and I'd go in. I'd work with a family over the course of time for 100 hours total. And this was a program that I was doing consulting. So I would go in for various states, and I would work with these families that were really struggling. So I went in to evaluate Matthew at the request of a local caseworker in the community mental health center, due in part from his adopted mother's request. This woman, she worked for a year to be able to have them bring me in to work with her son. I mean, she was adamant that they bring me in, because at this time he was still in residential treatment. So at the time, Matthew was in a residential treatment center where he had resided for 2 years. It was $100,000 a year. He was at the highest level. At the time of evaluation, he was on 5 different psychotropic medications, diagnosed reactive attachment disorder, bipolar, psychotic, and oppositional defiant. He had only been home twice in 2 years, and outside in the sunshine only 5 times during a 2-year span. The product of an early environment of gross neglect, Matthew was locked in an attic with his younger brother repeatedly without food or toilet. He was also physically abused from birth to 4 years old. He was removed from his home, then he was in foster care for 2 years, and then he was adopted. 2 years following adoption, his adopted mother fell and sustained a traumatic injury. The family stress led to his adopted father hitting Matthew, leaving bruises on him. The school called the authorities. Matthew was, this is all while his mom was in the hospital. Matthew was eventually removed from the home because his adopted family ended up abandoning, his adopted father ended up abandoning the entire family. while Mom was still in the hospital. She had traumatic brain injury. And after he was taken into care following the incident, he disrupted the home after home until he eventually ended up in residential care. So a pretty serious story of a young man. So this is kind of a summary. During 2 years of residential care, so he got 24 hours, 7 days a week. He had been home twice in 2 years. He's on 5 different medications. He's outside 5 times, only outside 5 times because he could not get his points that would allow him to go outside. He hadn't been home. He'd only been home 2 years because oftentimes, right before it was time for a visit, he would disrupt or he'd do something he wasn't supposed to. Now, I understand why he does those kinds of things, but they didn't understand why he was doing those kinds of things. And at $100,000 a year, you would think that they would understand. So he had daily outbursts at this time. He was getting no education. There was no education provided to this young man. This was cost. It said at this point it had cost $200,000, and his final diagnosis at discharge against doctor's orders was psychotic, in opposition or defiant. I spent 6 months with this family. 6 months. We did 50 hours of direct therapy where I went into their home and worked with them over the span of a couple weekends, and then we did 50 hours of consultation where I worked with the mom on the phone, or I worked with the school, or I worked with the caseworker, whatever. We got him home. We removed him from the hospital. We took him home. We did the therapy. He never went back to the hospital. He eventually got off all his medication. He had increased muscle tone. I've got a picture of him somewhere. I can't remember where it's at. He had 5 outbursts in the span of 6 months. 5 outbursts. He was active in getting educated. It cost $100 an hour. It really about $10,000 for the program. His final diagnosis was post-traumatic stress disorder and developmental deficit. He was 12 years old at the time. 12 years old. The reason I give you the summary is to let you know that what you're going to be learning is what has gone into being able to create a paradigm in a family that brings about this kind of change. He's now 22 years old. He's got a job. He's an airline pilot, an airplane pilot, not a pilot, a mechanic. He wanted to be an Air Force pilot, but he had some, because of his history, he had some challenges. They wouldn't take him in the Air Force. So he became a mechanic. So he's doing very well. But I said I give you the summary. This very third different child, this child who comes from a lot of trauma, comes from a lot of abuse, comes from a lot of neglect, because that's what I've spent the last 15 years of my life working in. And that's what's going to go into creating this 16-week program. This is what I want you to understand. I want you to understand, maybe not so that you can necessarily do this level of work, because this was actually therapy work, but you can do a level of coaching that's unlike anything else that anyone else is offering. You can provide a level of parenting unlike anything else that you've been doing. You just have, and that's what we're going to do over the next 16 weeks. So in this course, you're going to learn about adoption like no one has ever taught you before. That's what I'm promising at the end of the day. You're going to learn about adoption, every facet of adoption like no one has ever taught you before. And then you're going to you're going to learn how to help others. We're going to do that too. So you're going to help yourself, you're going to help your family, you're going to help your own children, and then you're going to be helping other people. So welcome to the 16-week adoption, parenting, coaching, and certification program.